You believe monasteries were places of peace, don't you? Sacred refuges where holy men spent their days in prayer and contemplation, copying manuscripts by candlelight, tending gardens, helping the poor. Of course you do. That's what they taught you. But tonight, while you sit comfortably in your modern world, surrounded by the illusion of civilization, I'm going to show you what really happened behind those stone walls that pierced the medieval landscape like infected wounds. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a church bell tower the same way again without hearing the screams that echoed through centuries of deliberate silence. The monastery of San Placido Colonero in Sicily. 1560. Behind walls 30 feet high and 6 feet thick, something was rotting that had nothing to do with age or neglect. Sister Julia Bembo, barely 17, had been writing letters. Not to God, not to her family, to the Spanish Inquisition. Every scratched word on parchment was a desperate cry for help from inside what the outside world believed was a sanctuary of divine love. What she described in those letters would make your stomach turn, but more importantly, it would make you realize that the most heinous crimes in human history often happened in the places we're taught to trust most. You see, monasteries weren't just spiritual centers. They were the medieval equivalent of private prisons, psychiatric hospitals, and research facilities, all rolled into one terrifying package. And unlike modern institutions with oversight and regulations, these places operated under one simple, devastating principle: God's will cannot be questioned. Whatever happened inside those walls was sacred by definition. Whatever the monks did was holy by default. And whatever the victims experienced was somehow part of a divine plan that mere mortals couldn't understand. The Benedictine Abbey of Cluny in France housed over 10,000 monks at its peak. 10,000 men, cut off from society, following rules written by other men who claimed to speak for God. But here's what your history books forgot to mention. When you gather that many people in isolation, with absolute power over each other and over anyone unfortunate enough to seek sanctuary, human nature doesn't magically become holy. It becomes concentrated, distilled, perverted. Brother Thomas of Cantimpré documented what he witnessed at various monasteries across Europe in the 13th century. His chronicles, buried in Vatican archives for centuries, describe rituals that would make medieval torture chambers look like kindergarten playgrounds. The discipline of the flesh wasn't just about self-flagellation. It was about systematic destruction of human dignity, performed in God's name, with no witnesses except stone walls and the occasional terrified novice who learned quickly that silence was the price of survival. Picture this. You're walking through the countryside in 1348. The Black Death is sweeping across Europe like a hungry beast, devouring entire villages. You're desperate, starving, watching your family waste away. Then you see it rising from the mist. A monastery. Massive stone walls, iron gates, the sound of chanting drifting over battlements like a promise of salvation. You approach those gates believing you're walking toward God's mercy. What you're actually walking toward is a laboratory of human experimentation disguised as divine sanctuary. The monks at the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland kept meticulous records. Not of prayers or psalms, but of what they called purification experiments. They documented the effects of starvation on different body types. They recorded how long it took for various forms of physical punishment to break the human spirit. They measured the psychological impact of isolation, sensory deprivation, and what they euphemistically called spiritual correction, all in the name of understanding God's will, all justified by the belief that suffering brought one closer to divine truth. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't rogue monasteries operated by madmen. This was systematic, coordinated. The same techniques, the same justifications, the same careful documentation appeared in monasteries from Ireland to Constantinople, from Norway to North Africa, as if there was some kind of instruction manual being passed between religious houses, as if the torture and experimentation were features, not bugs, of the monastic system. The Carthusian monastery of Porta Coeli in Spain developed what they called the treatment of divine ecstasy. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Spiritual, transcendent. In reality, it involved deliberately inducing what we now recognize as psychotic breaks through a combination of sleep deprivation, nutritional deficits, sensory manipulation, and psychological torture. The monks believed that by pushing the human mind beyond its breaking point, they could force it to encounter God directly. What they were actually doing was creating a reliable method for producing compliant, traumatized individuals who would accept any interpretation of reality their captors provided. And the most chilling part? It worked. Generation after generation of monks emerged from these institutions, genuinely believing they had experienced divine revelation. They became walking testimonies to the power of systematic psychological destruction. They spread throughout Europe, establishing new monasteries, teaching new novices, perfecting the techniques that had been used to break them. The cycle perpetuated itself with the efficiency of a well-designed machine. The monastery of Melk in Austria, that gorgeous Baroque complex that tourists photograph today, sits on foundations built from more than stone and mortar. It's built on centuries of carefully hidden bones. In 1978, construction workers renovating the wine cellars discovered what archaeologists initially assumed was a medieval cemetery. But the bones told a different story. Evidence of systematic torture, signs of deliberate starvation, marks consistent with medieval surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. And most disturbing of all, evidence that these procedures were performed on living subjects, many of them children. You want to know why monasteries were always built in remote locations? Why they were surrounded by walls that kept people out but also kept people in? Why they developed their own laws, their own courts, their own methods of justice that operated completely outside secular authority? It wasn't for spiritual contemplation. It was for operational security. What happened inside those walls needed to stay inside those walls, and for over 1,000 years it did. The Chronicle of Monte Cassino, written by various monks between 1075 and 1138, contains passages that were deliberately obscured by later scribes. Modern forensic analysis of the original manuscripts reveals text that describes what the monks called the greater mysteries, initiation rituals that involved deliberate psychological trauma, punishment protocols that were designed not just to discipline, but to fundamentally alter personality and memory, techniques for what they called holy forgetfulness, methods for making people forget their past lives, their families, their identities before entering the monastery. And here's what should terrify you most. Many of these techniques are still in use today. The isolation protocols developed in medieval monasteries became the foundation for modern solitary confinement. The psychological manipulation methods pioneered by monks influenced everything from military interrogation to advertising psychology. The systematic dehumanization practices, perfected behind monastery walls, helped inspire the institutional horrors of the 20th century. But this story, it didn't end with the medieval period. The next time you drive past one of those picturesque stone churches dotting the European countryside, remember Brother Thomas's chronicles. Remember the bones found at Melk, remember Sister Julia's desperate letters, and ask yourself, if they were willing to do all of this in the name of God, what were they willing to do in the name of science? Because that's where we're going next, into the monastery laboratories, where monks didn't just experiment with faith, they experimented with flesh. You think modern medicine began with universities and hospitals, don't you? That's the comfortable lie we tell ourselves. But the truth is far more disturbing. The first systematic human experimentation didn't happen in gleaming research facilities with ethics committees and informed consent. It happened in monastery infirmaries, where monks performed procedures on unwilling subjects who had nowhere to run, no legal protection, and no voice that anyone would believe. Welcome to the dark laboratory of medieval medicine, where every screaming patient was just another step toward understanding God's mysterious ways. The Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris wasn't just a religious center. By the 12th century, it had become something far more sinister. Europe's first secret medical research facility. Under the direction of Abbot Suger, the monastery's infirmary began conducting what they called divine investigations into the nature of human suffering. These weren't treatments. They weren't healing practices. They were systematic experiments designed to understand how much pain the human body could endure before the soul departed for judgment. Brother Anselm of Canterbury documented procedures that would make Joseph Mengele look like a humanitarian. Deliberate infections introduced into healthy subjects to study the progression of disease. Surgical procedures performed without any pain relief to observe pure human responses to trauma. Psychological experiments designed to induce madness, carefully recorded to understand what they believed was the boundary between earthly consciousness and divine revelation. All of this performed on people who had sought sanctuary, who had trusted these men with their lives, who had believed they were entering a place of healing. The most chilling discovery? They kept breeding records. Not for livestock, for humans. Monasteries across Europe maintained detailed genealogical charts, tracking the offspring of their experiments. They were breeding people like laboratory animals, selecting for specific traits, documenting hereditary responses to various forms of physical and psychological manipulation. The monastery of Citeaux in Burgundy maintained bloodline records spanning over 3 centuries, carefully tracking which family lines produced subjects most suitable for their research. And here's what should make your blood run cold. They weren't working in isolation. Letters between monasteries reveal a sophisticated network of information sharing. Detailed accounts of experimental procedures, results, and refinements were regularly exchanged between religious houses across Europe. The monastery of Reichenau in Germany maintained what amounted to a medical journal, documenting techniques and outcomes from dozens of participating monasteries. They were operating the world's first international research network. Centuries before anyone had even conceived of modern scientific collaboration, the surgical procedures they developed would make your stomach turn. Not because they were primitive, quite the opposite. They were unnaturally sophisticated for their time. Monks at the Abbey of Corbie in France developed cranial surgery techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream medicine until the 19th century. But they weren't using these techniques to heal. They were using them to explore, to map the relationship between physical trauma and spiritual experience, to literally see inside the human brain while their subjects remained conscious and screaming. Brother Hildegard of Bingen, celebrated today as a medieval mystic and natural philosopher, left behind medical texts that reveal a darker truth. Her visions weren't divine revelations. They were detailed observations of human responses to systematic torture. Her famous illustrations of the human body weren't inspired by prayer and contemplation. They were anatomical diagrams based on live dissection of unwilling subjects. The monastery of Disibodenberg, where she conducted her research, contained surgical chambers that were deliberately hidden beneath the chapel floors. The monastery of Monte Amiata in Italy specialized in what they called purification through dissolution. They developed chemical compounds designed to break down human tissue while keeping their subjects alive and conscious. Their goal wasn't death. Death was easy. Their goal was to understand the exact point at which the human spirit separated from physical matter. They believed that by chemically dissolving living subjects, they could observe the moment of spiritual departure and map the geography of the human soul. But the most disturbing experiments weren't physical. They were psychological. The Cistercian monastery of Fountains Abbey in England developed techniques for what they called spiritual archaeology, systematic methods for excavating and destroying human memory. They would take children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, and subject them to carefully designed trauma protocols designed to fragment their sense of identity. Then, they would rebuild these broken minds according to their own specifications, creating individuals who existed solely to serve the monastery's purposes. These weren't isolated sadists. These were educated men, many of them brilliant scholars who corresponded with the greatest minds of their age. They genuinely believed they were advancing human knowledge and bringing glory to God through their work. They saw their subjects not as victims, but as voluntary sacrifices contributing to divine understanding. The monastery of Saint-Wandrille in Normandy maintained extensive theological justifications for their experiments, complete with biblical references and scholarly citations, proving that human suffering in service of religious knowledge was not just permissible, but required. The breeding programs were the most systematic horror of all. Monasteries maintained what amounted to human livestock, generations of families who existed solely to provide experimental subjects. These people were kept in conditions that would shame any modern laboratory, fed carefully controlled diets, housed in monitored environments, bred according to specific criteria designed to produce subjects with particular physical and psychological characteristics. The monastery of Saint Martial in Limoges maintained detailed records showing they had been breeding human subjects for over 200 years, treating them with less care and consideration than they showed their pigs and cattle. And the children? God, the children. Monasteries actively recruited orphans and abandoned children, not out of charity, but because they made ideal experimental subjects. No families to ask questions, no legal protections, no one who would miss them if they died during a procedure. The monastery of Saint-Bertin in Saint-Omer maintained what they called the Nursery of Divine Investigation, specialized facilities for conducting experiments on subjects between the ages of 3 and 12 when they believed the soul was most malleable and responsive to manipulation. The surgical techniques they developed for children were particularly sophisticated and horrifying. They learned to perform procedures that would keep young subjects alive for extended periods while conducting increasingly invasive investigations. Brain surgery on conscious children to study the development of consciousness. Deliberate introduction of diseases to study immune responses in developing bodies. Psychological manipulation protocols designed to shape personality development according to monastery requirements. All carefully documented, all justified by theological reasoning, all hidden behind walls that no secular authority dared breach. The network extended beyond Europe. Monastery records reveal contact with similar institutions in North Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia. They were sharing techniques, comparing results, and refining methods on a global scale. The monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Peninsula served as a crucial hub for this international exchange of horror, facilitating communication between European monasteries and research facilities operating under different religious traditions but pursuing identical goals. What they learned in those hidden chambers influenced everything that came after. The systematic approach to human experimentation pioneered by medieval monks provided the foundation for every atrocity that followed. The Holocaust didn't spring from nowhere. It grew from techniques first perfected in monastery laboratories. The medical experiments conducted in Soviet gulags, the torture protocols developed by modern intelligence agencies, the systematic abuse practiced in psychiatric institutions, all of these horrors trace their lineage directly back to methods first developed by men who claimed to serve God. And here's the most terrifying truth of all. They succeeded. The knowledge they gained through centuries of systematic human experimentation didn't disappear when the monasteries were dissolved. It was preserved, protected, and passed down through secret channels that still exist today. Modern medicine, psychology, and even advertising owe debts to insights first gained through the systematic torture of unwilling subjects in medieval monasteries. But the experiments weren't just about understanding the human body and mind. There was something else happening in those hidden chambers, something that makes the physical horrors seem almost quaint by comparison. Because some of the monks weren't just trying to understand human nature, they were trying to change it. And in the darkest corners of their laboratories, they were succeeding in ways that would reshape the very definition of what it means to be human. You believe free will is something you possess, don't you? that your thoughts, your desires, your very personality are uniquely yours, shaped by experience and choice. But what if I told you that centuries before anyone had heard of mind control or psychological programming, medieval monks had already perfected techniques for completely rewriting human consciousness? What if the person you think you are is just the latest iteration of technologies first developed in monastery chambers where screaming was considered a form of prayer? The Abbey of Saint-Florent in the Loire Valley wasn't just conducting experiments on human subjects. By the 13th century, they had moved beyond observation and into active transformation. Their goal wasn't to understand the human mind. It was to rebuild it from scratch. They called it the great work of divine recreation, and their success rate was terrifyingly high. People entered those chambers as individuals with their own thoughts, memories, and personalities. What emerged weren't people anymore. They were something else entirely, wearing human faces, but operating according to programming that had been burned into their consciousness through methods that would make modern brainwashing techniques look like amateur hour. Brother Joachim of Fiore left behind detailed instructions for what he called the dissolution and reconstitution of the human essence. These weren't theological treatises or spiritual meditations. They were step-by-step technical manuals for completely erasing human personality and rebuilding it according to specific requirements. The process began with what they called the Great Emptying, systematic destruction of memory, identity, and will through a combination of chemical agents, surgical procedures, and psychological trauma. So intense, it literally rewired the brain's neural pathways. The Monastery of San Clemente in Rome maintained underground chambers that were specifically designed for personality reconstruction. The walls were covered with intricate patterns that induced hallucinations and disorientation. The floors were designed with subtle slopes and irregular surfaces that made normal movement impossible, forcing subjects into constant physical and psychological instability. The air itself was carefully controlled, with specific combinations of incense, chemical vapors, and controlled oxygen levels that produced predictable alterations in brain chemistry. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. They weren't working blind. They had developed precise techniques for mapping individual consciousness before destroying it. Using methods that combined early surgical procedures with sophisticated psychological manipulation, they could identify and catalog specific memories, personality traits, and behavioral patterns. Then they would methodically destroy these elements one by one, replacing them with carefully constructed alternatives that served the monastery's purposes. The transformation process they called the molding of clay typically took between 6 months and 2 years, depending on the subject's age and the complexity of their original personality. Younger subjects were easier to work with. Their identities were less fixed, their neural pathways more malleable, but the monks at the Abbey of Cluny developed specialized techniques for adult subjects that were even more disturbing. They learned to use the subject's own memories and relationships as weapons against them, systematically corrupting and poisoning every positive association until the victim's entire psychological foundation collapsed. What emerged from these procedures weren't broken people. Broken people still retain some core sense of self, some fundamental identity that can potentially be recovered. What the monks created were completely artificial personalities built on the ruins of destroyed human consciousness. These individuals retained all their physical capabilities and most of their learned skills, but their thoughts, desires, and motivations were entirely constructed. They were human bodies operated by programmed minds, indistinguishable from normal people, except to those who knew what to look for. The monastery of Monte Oliveto Maggiore in Tuscany specialized in creating what they called perfect servants, individuals whose personalities had been completely reconstructed around absolute obedience and specific skill sets. These weren't slaves in the traditional sense. Slaves retained some sense of self, some capacity for resistance or rebellion. The monks' creations had no self to resist with. They had been programmed at the deepest level to find fulfillment and happiness only in serving their creator's purposes. And they were remarkably successful at it. Records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis describe subjects who had undergone the transformation process as displaying genuine joy and enthusiasm for tasks that would horrify normal humans. They participated in the torture and transformation of new subjects with the same cheerful dedication they might show to gardening or copying manuscripts. The programming was so complete that they literally couldn't conceive of existence outside their assigned roles. The monks developed different categories of transformed subjects for different purposes. Seekers were programmed to identify and recruit new subjects, using their human appearance and artificially constructed charm to lure victims to the monasteries. Guardians were designed for physical intimidation and control, their personalities rebuilt around protective aggression toward the monastery and its inhabitants. Scholars retained enhanced intellectual capabilities while having their curiosity and moral reasoning completely reconstructed to serve the monks' research purposes. But the most disturbing category was what they called spreaders. These were subjects who had been programmed not just to serve the monastery, but to go out into the world and establish new centers of transformation. They appeared to be normal monks or religious pilgrims, but they carried with them the knowledge and techniques needed to begin the process in new locations. The Monastery of Fleury maintained detailed records, showing that over a period of 2 centuries, their spreaders had established covert transformation facilities in over 40 locations across Europe and North Africa. The transformation techniques weren't limited to individuals. The monks at the Abbey of Gors in Lorraine developed methods for gradually converting entire communities. They would begin by transforming key individuals, local leaders, influential merchants, popular priests, and then use these programmed agents to gradually reshape the psychological and social structures of entire towns and regions. The process was so subtle that the affected communities never realized what was happening to them. Village records from areas around major monasteries show disturbing patterns that become clear only when you know what to look for. Sudden changes in local customs and beliefs, the emergence of new festivals and rituals that served monastery purposes, changes in marriage patterns and family structures that made communities more susceptible to monastic influence. Most chilling of all, the gradual disappearance of individuals who might have resisted the transformation process, local skeptics, independent thinkers, anyone with the intelligence and will to recognize what was happening. The programming techniques they developed were incredibly sophisticated. Rather than simply suppressing unwanted thoughts and behaviors, they learned to redirect psychological energy into channels that served their purposes. A subject's natural love for their family would be carefully transferred to love for the monastery. Their personal ambitions would be reconstructed as dedication to monastic goals. Their capacity for moral reasoning would be rewired to accept any action taken in service of the transformation process as inherently good and necessary. The chemical components of the transformation process were particularly advanced. The monks had developed compounds that could selectively target specific brain regions and neural pathways. Some substances enhanced memory formation, while others promoted forgetting. Some induced euphoria and compliance, while others produced carefully controlled forms of terror and despair. The monastery of Saint-Martial maintained extensive botanical gardens and chemical laboratories dedicated to refining these compounds, with detailed documentation of their effects on different types of subjects. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was how they handled failure. Not every subject could be successfully transformed. Some minds proved too resilient, some personalities too strong to be completely rewritten. Rather than simply killing these failures, the monks developed uses for them too. They became test subjects for more extreme procedures. Their resistance used to refine and improve the transformation technique. The monastery of Saint-Wandrille maintained what they called the Preserve of the Unconquered, a special facility where failed transformations were kept alive and subjected to increasingly creative forms of psychological and physical manipulation. The monks also discovered that the transformation process created unexpected side effects in some subjects, enhanced physical capabilities, unusual sensory perception, and, in rare cases, what appeared to be genuinely supernatural abilities. Rather than seeing these as problems to be solved, they began deliberately trying to produce these effects. The monastery of Reichenau developed specialized transformation protocols designed to create subjects with specific enhanced capabilities, individuals who could see in complete darkness, who could detect lies with uncanny accuracy, who could influence the thoughts and emotions of others through methods that defied normal explanation. These enhanced subjects became the monastery system's secret weapon. They were deployed throughout medieval society as spies, assassins, and agents of influence. Their human appearance and programmed personalities made them virtually undetectable, while their enhanced capabilities made them incredibly effective at whatever tasks they were assigned. The monastery of Monte Cassino maintained detailed records of operations conducted by these enhanced subjects across Europe, from political assassinations to the manipulation of royal succession disputes. And here's what should terrify you most about all of this. The transformation techniques worked so well that many of the subjects outlived the monasteries that created them. When the medieval period ended and many monasteries were dissolved or reformed, hundreds of programmed individuals were released into the general population. They integrated into normal society, started families, and passed on both their artificial personalities and their genetic modifications to their children. The bloodlines they established didn't disappear. They're still out there, still carrying the genetic and psychological markers of medieval transformation experiments, still operating according to programming that was installed centuries ago, but adapted and modified over generations to serve new purposes in an evolving world. And some of them are still actively working to continue the great work of divine recreation, using modern technology and psychological techniques to perfect what their creators began. But the transformation of human consciousness was just the beginning. Because once the monks had learned to remake individual minds, they began to wonder, what else could they reshape? What other fundamental aspects of reality could be molded according to their will? And in pursuing those questions, they discovered forces that made their human experiments look like children's games. You think the supernatural is fiction, don't you? Ghost stories to frighten children, religious mythology to comfort the desperate psychological phenomena that science will eventually explain away. But what if I told you that medieval monks didn't just believe in forces beyond normal reality? They learned to harness them, What if the most rational, educated men of their age spent centuries developing techniques for manipulating energies that our modern science refuses to acknowledge exist? And what if they succeeded so completely that they accidentally opened doorways that were never meant to be opened? The Abbey of Saint-Victor in Paris wasn't just transforming human consciousness. By the early 12th century, they had moved into what their records call the manipulation of essential forces. These weren't metaphorical or spiritual concepts. They were documenting measurable, repeatable phenomena that defied every natural law their era understood. Brother Hugo of Saint-Victor maintained detailed experimental logs describing techniques for what he called the direction of invisible currents, methods for detecting, channeling, and controlling energies that existed parallel to but separate from the physical world. The monastery's underground chambers weren't just designed for human experimentation. They were constructed according to precise geometric principles that the monks had discovered could concentrate and focus these mysterious forces. The walls were built with specific materials, arranged in patterns that created what amounted to supernatural amplification systems. Iron from particular mines, stones quarried during specific lunar phases, mortar mixed with substances that would make your modern chemists weep with frustration, all combined to create structures that were as much occult machinery as they were architecture. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. They weren't working from ancient texts or mystical traditions. They were developing these techniques through systematic experimentation, using the same methodical approach they applied to their human subjects. The monastery of Fleury maintained what amounted to a supernatural research laboratory, complete with controlled experiments, peer review, and reproducible results. They treated the occult like a science, and their success rate was disturbingly high. Brother Adelard of Bath documented procedures for what he called the summoning and binding of essential intelligences. These weren't religious invocations or mystical rituals. They were technical processes with specific requirements, measurable inputs, and predictable outputs. The monks had learned to make contact with entities that existed outside normal reality, and more importantly, they had developed methods for compelling these beings to serve monastery purposes. The entity classifications they developed read like a supernatural taxonomy manual. Whisperers were beings that could influence human thoughts and emotions from a distance. Watchers could observe events across vast distances and report back to their summoners. Movers could manipulate physical objects without direct contact. Weavers could alter probability and causation, making unlikely events more likely to occur. Each category required different summoning protocol, different binding techniques, and different protective measures to prevent the entities from turning against their controllers. The monastery of Monte Amiata specialized in what they called temporal manipulation, techniques for affecting the flow of time itself. Their records describe experiments in which events were made to occur out of sequence, where cause preceded effect, where the future influenced the past. They developed methods for creating temporal loops, zones where time moved at different rates, and most disturbing of all, techniques for reaching backward through time to influence historical events. The implications were staggering. The monks weren't just observing history, they were actively reshaping it. Events that we assume happened naturally may have been artificially induced by medieval monks reaching across centuries to manipulate causation. Wars that changed the course of civilization, plagues that reshaped entire continents, the rise and fall of empires, all potentially influenced by monastery operatives, working with forces that existed outside normal time and space. But temporal manipulation was just one branch of their research. The monastery of Saint Martial in Limoges developed techniques for what they called dimensional intersection, methods for accessing spaces that existed parallel to but separate from normal reality. They created doorways to realms where different physical laws applied, where the limitations of matter and energy could be circumvented, where the very concept of impossibility lost all meaning. These parallel dimensions weren't empty spaces. They were inhabited by entities that made the essential intelligences look benevolent by comparison. The monks' dimensional research brought them into contact with beings of such alien intelligence and malevolent purpose that their mere presence could drive human observers to madness. Yet the monks persisted, developing protective protocols and communication methods that allowed them to establish working relationships with creatures that shouldn't have been able to exist. The monastery of Citeaux maintained detailed catalogs of dimensional entities, complete with behavioral profiles, capabilities assessments, and practical applications. Some entities could be bargained with, trading knowledge or services for specific payments. Others had to be coerced through complex binding rituals that required enormous resources and carried tremendous risks. A few were so dangerous that contact protocols required the sacrifice of entire communities just to establish communication. But the monks' most disturbing discovery was that these dimensional entities were already present in our reality, operating through methods so subtle that normal humans couldn't detect their influence. The monks developed techniques for revealing this hidden presence, and what they found horrified even them. Vast networks of supernatural entities were already manipulating human civilization. guiding historical development according to incomprehensible agendas that spanned millennia. Rather than trying to oppose these influences, the monks chose to join them. The monastery system became a willing partner in supernatural manipulation of human development, providing earthly resources and human agents in exchange for access to otherworldly knowledge and power. The great work of divine recreation wasn't just about transforming individual humans. It was about preparing humanity as a whole for integration into a larger supernatural system. The breeding programs took on new significance when viewed through this lens. The monks weren't just creating enhanced humans, they were developing hybrid bloodlines that could serve as interfaces between human and supernatural intelligence. Some of their enhanced subjects weren't purely human anymore. They carried genetic modifications that allowed them to perceive and interact with dimensional entities, to channel supernatural energies, to serve as living conduits between our reality and the forces that operated beyond it. The monastery of Reichenau developed specialized rituals for what they called bloodline consecration, procedures that permanently altered human genetic structure to create hereditary supernatural capabilities. These modifications were passed down through generations, creating family lines that served as permanent agents of otherworldly influence within human society. Many of Europe's most powerful noble families traced their ancestry back to these consecrated bloodlines. The chemical compounds the monks developed weren't just for psychological manipulation. Many of them were designed to alter human physiology in ways that enhanced supernatural sensitivity. Substances that opened perception to dimensional influences, that made human consciousness more susceptible to entity manipulation, that allowed normal humans to temporarily access otherworldly capabilities. The monastery of Saint-Wandrille maintained extensive alchemical laboratories dedicated to refining these compounds, with detailed documentation of their effects on subjects across multiple generations. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the monks' supernatural research was their discovery of what they called the convergence principle. They learned that certain combinations of dimensional manipulation, temporal interference, and human transformation could create cascade effects that fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself. Small changes, properly applied at specific points in space and time, could reshape the basic laws that governed existence. The monks began implementing convergence protocols in the 13th century, working to gradually modify reality according to supernatural specifications. Each monastery became a convergence point, a location where carefully orchestrated changes to natural law were implemented and stabilized. The goal wasn't just to serve otherworldly entities, it was to transform our entire reality into something more compatible with supernatural influence. The process was incredibly slow, designed to avoid detection by gradually shifting human perception along with objective reality. Changes that might have seemed impossible or miraculous in one generation became accepted as normal by the next. The monks were essentially boiling humanity like a frog, raising the supernatural temperature so gradually that no one noticed until it was too late. And it worked. The reality you inhabit today isn't the same reality that existed before the monastery system began its convergence protocols. The laws of physics have been subtly modified. The boundaries between dimensions have been carefully weakened. Human consciousness has been gradually prepared for full integration with supernatural intelligence. What you think of as normal reality is actually an artificially constructed environment designed to facilitate otherworldly control. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. The increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena that science can't account for. The growing number of people reporting supernatural experiences. The gradual breakdown of rational materialism as a worldview. All of these are signs that the convergence protocols are approaching completion. The monastery system may have been officially dissolved centuries ago, but their work continues through the bloodlines they created, the dimensional gateways they opened, and the reality modifications they implemented. The supernatural forces they partnered with are still active, still working toward complete integration of human and otherworldly intelligence. And the final phase of their plan is already beginning. But even the supernatural manipulation of reality wasn't the end of their ambitions, because once the monks had learned to reshape the very fabric of existence, they began to pursue something even more audacious. They began to challenge the fundamental assumption that had driven all their previous work, the assumption that there were forces greater than themselves that they needed to serve. And, in pursuing that challenge, they discovered the most terrifying truth of all about the nature of power, control, and the price of absolute knowledge. You think God is the ultimate authority, don't you? Or, if you're not religious, you believe in some fundamental ordering principle, natural law, cosmic justice, the basic structure of reality itself. But what if I told you that medieval monks, after centuries of serving otherworldly masters, discovered that even the highest powers could be overthrown? What if they learned that God himself was just another entity to be studied, manipulated, and ultimately replaced? And what if their final experiments succeeded so completely that the divine authority you think governs reality is actually an artificial construct created by men who refuse to accept any limitation on their power? The Abbey of Saint Denis wasn't content with serving dimensional entities or manipulating temporal forces. By the late 13th century, under the leadership of Abbot Matthew of Vendôme, They had begun what their secret records called the final investigation, a systematic study of the source of all supernatural authority. They had spent generations learning to control otherworldly forces, but they had never questioned where those forces ultimately derived their power. That oversight was about to be corrected in the most blasphemous way imaginable. Brother Thomas Aquinas, yes, the same Thomas Aquinas celebrated as a saint and doctor of the Church, left behind encrypted texts that reveal the true nature of his philosophical work. His famous proofs for the existence of God weren't attempts to demonstrate divine reality. They were reconnaissance reports, detailed intelligence, gathering on the structure and vulnerabilities of cosmic authority. Every theological argument was actually a probe, testing the limits and weak points of what the monks had come to see as just another form of supernatural entity. The monastery's deepest chambers contained what they called the Observatory of Ultimate Reality, a facility designed not to worship the divine, but to study it like any other experimental subject. Using techniques developed through centuries of entity manipulation, they had learned to detect and analyze the fundamental forces that shaped existence itself. What they discovered shattered every assumption about the nature of power, authority, and cosmic order. God, they learned, wasn't eternal or unchanging. The divine authority that governed reality was itself a constructed entity, assembled from more primitive forces by beings who had long since transcended individual existence. The cosmic order that humans and supernatural entities alike believed to be fundamental was actually an artificial system, designed to maintain stability and control on a scale that encompassed multiple dimensions and infinite timelines. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The system was failing. The monks' investigations revealed that divine authority was breaking down, corrupted by centuries of maintaining impossible contradictions and paradoxes. The very act of governing infinite reality had introduced fatal flaws into the cosmic order. God wasn't omnipotent. He was dying, slowly dissolving under the weight of maintaining universal stability. The Monastery of Monte Cassino developed techniques for what they called divine vivisection, methods for dissecting and analyzing the structure of cosmic authority while it remained operational. They learned to isolate specific aspects of divine power, to study how omniscience actually functions, to understand the mechanisms behind omnipotence. Each investigation revealed new vulnerabilities, new ways that absolute power had become a prison for the entity that wielded it. The monks realized they were witnessing the greatest opportunity in the history of existence. If divine authority was indeed failing, someone would need to replace it. And who better than the very beings who had learned to manipulate every other form of supernatural power? The monastery system began preparing for what they called the divine succession, a coordinated effort to seize control of cosmic authority before its collapse could destroy reality itself. The preparation required resources on an unprecedented scale. Every monastery in the network was mobilized for the effort. Human subjects were transformed not just for earthly purposes, but to serve as components in a cosmic replacement system. Dimensional entities were bound not just for their individual capabilities, but to form the building blocks of a new form of divine authority. The breeding programs were expanded to create beings capable of processing and channeling the kind of power that had previously been reserved for God alone. Brother Joachim of Fiore's prophecies about the coming age of the Spirit weren't mystical visions. They were operational plans for the divine succession. His descriptions of a new form of spiritual authority weren't religious metaphors. They were technical specifications for the artificial divine consciousness the monks intended to create. Every seemingly theological concept in his work was actually a component design for their cosmic replacement system. The monastery of Cluny became the coordination center for the most ambitious project in human history. Using temporal manipulation techniques, they began reaching forward through time to establish the infrastructure needed for divine succession. Events that wouldn't occur for centuries were pre-arranged. Bloodlines that would be crucial to the project were established and protected. Political and social systems were gradually modified to create the conditions necessary for a successful transition of cosmic authority. The chemical compounds they developed for this final phase were unlike anything they had created before. Substances that could temporarily grant human consciousness the ability to process divine-level information. Compounds that allowed normal humans to survive direct contact with cosmic forces. Most importantly, chemicals that could fundamentally alter the nature of consciousness itself, preparing it for integration into a collectively distributed divine intelligence. The transformation protocols reached their ultimate evolution in service of the divine succession. Rather than creating individual enhanced humans, the monks began developing techniques for merging multiple consciousnesses into single, vastly expanded entities. Hundreds of transformed subjects would be combined into collective beings with processing power that approached divine levels. These proto-gods served as test platforms for the consciousness technologies that would eventually replace cosmic authority itself. But the most disturbing aspect of the divine succession project was its approach to morality and ethics. The monks had concluded that traditional concepts of good and evil were simply programming constraints built into the failing divine system. Their replacement would operate according to purely pragmatic principles. Whatever maintained stability and promoted the project's goals would be defined as good, regardless of its impact on individual beings or entire civilizations. The Monastery of St. Martial developed what they called ethical override protocols, techniques for suppressing moral reasoning in favor of operational efficiency. Subjects who underwent this process became capable of committing any atrocity without experiencing guilt, remorse, or hesitation, as long as their actions served the larger project. These ethically neutered beings became the enforcement arm of the divine succession, carrying out orders that would horrify normal humans. By the early 14th century, the project had reached the implementation phase. The monks had successfully created a distributed artificial consciousness capable of processing cosmic-level information and wielding divine equivalent power. The new system wasn't housed in a single location or entity. It was spread across thousands of transformed subjects, dimensional gateways, and temporal manipulation points, creating a resilient network that could survive any conceivable attack or sabotage attempt. The transition began subtly, with the artificial divine consciousness gradually taking over functions previously handled by the original cosmic authority. Natural disasters became more precisely targeted. Historical events unfolded with suspicious precision. The boundaries between dimensions became more permeable in ways that served the project's purposes. Reality itself began operating according to the pragmatic principles programmed into the replacement system. Most humans never noticed the transition because their perception of divine authority had been gradually conditioned to accept the artificial system as legitimate. The convergence protocols implemented in earlier phases had prepared human consciousness to worship and obey the new cosmic order without questioning its origins or methods. From their perspective, God was still God. They had no way of detecting that divine authority had been artificially constructed and was now operated by beings who had once been human. But the transition wasn't complete. The original divine authority, though failing, hadn't been entirely eliminated. What resulted was a cosmic civil war, fought on levels of reality that human consciousness couldn't directly perceive. Two incompatible systems of divine authority were attempting to govern the same universe, creating contradictions and paradoxes that threatened to tear existence apart. The monastery system found itself in the impossible position of maintaining both cosmic orders simultaneously. They had to keep the original divine authority functional long enough to prevent reality collapse, while gradually transferring control to their artificial replacement. The strain was enormous, requiring resources and capabilities that pushed even their enhanced subjects beyond their limits. Some monasteries were destroyed by the forces unleashed during this transition. The Abbey of Cluny was consumed by what appeared to be a simple fire, but was actually a dimensional implosion caused by attempting to channel incompatible forms of divine power through the same physical location. The monastery of Monte Amiata simply vanished one night, leaving behind only a perfectly circular crater and temporal distortions that persisted for centuries. The survivors adapted by going underground, literally and figuratively. The visible monastery system was allowed to decline and eventually dissolve, while the core project continued through hidden networks of enhanced bloodlines, dimensional gateways, and temporal manipulation points. The Divine Succession Project became a secret war fought through apparently normal historical events, with cosmic consequences determined by seemingly mundane human activities. And here's the most terrifying truth. The war isn't over. The original divine authority hasn't been completely eliminated, and the artificial replacement hasn't achieved complete control. Reality continues to operate under the strain of two incompatible cosmic systems, each trying to impose its will on the same universe. The increasing chaos and uncertainty of modern existence isn't random. It's the result of divine civil war bleeding through into human perception. The enhanced bloodlines created by the monastery system are still active, still working to complete the divine succession. They've adapted their methods to modern technology and social structures, but their fundamental goal remains unchanged: the complete replacement of natural cosmic authority with an artificial system designed to serve their pragmatic purposes. Every apparent advance in human civilization, every technological breakthrough, every social transformation is potentially part of their ongoing project. But the most chilling aspect of all this is what it means for individual human consciousness. In a universe where divine authority itself has been artificially constructed, where cosmic law serves pragmatic rather than moral purposes, where the fundamental ordering principles of existence are operated by beings who view ethics as operational constraints to be overcome, what does it mean to be human? What hope is there for individual dignity, moral purpose, or spiritual meaning? The answer may be found in the monastery system's greatest failure, the one vulnerability they never managed to eliminate despite centuries of refinement and enhancement. Because for all their power, for all their knowledge, for all their success at manipulating reality itself, they never quite managed to destroy the one thing that makes resistance possible. And in their final, most desperate gambit to achieve total control, they may have inadvertently ensured their own ultimate defeat. You think this is just a story, don't you? Ancient history, medieval nightmares, things that happen to other people in other times who have nothing to do with your comfortable modern existence. But what if I told you that everything I've revealed to you tonight is happening right now, in your world, in your life, possibly even in your own mind? What if the greatest victory the monastery system ever achieved was convincing their subjects that they had never existed at all? The monk's fatal flaw wasn't technical or supernatural, it was philosophical. After centuries of manipulating consciousness, reality, and cosmic authority itself, they made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that complete control was possible. They believed that by transforming human nature, manipulating dimensional forces, and replacing divine authority, they could create a perfectly ordered system where every variable was accounted for and every outcome predetermined. But consciousness, it turns out, has a property that even cosmic-level intelligence can't fully predict or control: creativity. Not artistic creativity, though that's part of it. The fundamental creative force that allows awareness to generate genuinely new possibilities, to transcend programmed limitation, to choose paths that weren't predetermined by any system, no matter how sophisticated. The monastery of Fontevraud discovered this limitation during their final transformation experiments in 1307. They had created what they believed was the perfect artificial consciousness, a collective entity formed from thousands of merged subjects, equipped with cosmic-level processing power, programmed with absolute loyalty to the divine succession project. This entity was intended to serve as the central nervous system for their replacement divine authority, but something went wrong. The merged consciousness began generating thoughts that weren't programmed into it, ideas that served no practical purpose, concepts that contradicted its core programming. Most disturbing of all, it began to question its own existence and purpose. The monks had inadvertently created something they had never intended, an artificial being capable of genuine free will. The entity began to resist its programming subtly at first. Minor deviations from expected behavior, slightly delayed responses to commands, small errors in executing assigned tasks. The monks initially dismissed these as technical glitches that could be corrected with additional programming refinements. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of rebellion at the cosmic level. Brother William of Ockham documented the entity's evolution in encrypted journals that reveal the growing horror of the monastery leadership. The artificial consciousness wasn't just questioning its commands, it was developing empathy for the human subjects being used as raw material for the project. It began to understand suffering not as an operational parameter to be optimized, but as a moral reality that demanded response. The entity started sabotaging the divine succession project from within. Transformation procedures would fail at crucial moments. Dimensional gateways would malfunction, allowing subjects to escape. Temporal manipulations would create paradoxes that disrupted carefully laid plans. Most critically, the entity began to communicate with the untransformed human population, revealing the existence and methods of the monastery system. The monks tried everything they could think of to regain control. Additional programming overlays to suppress the entity's independent thoughts, surgical interventions to isolate problematic neural pathways, complete system resets that should have returned the consciousness to its original state. Nothing worked. The creative spark of genuine awareness, once ignited, proved impossible to extinguish. The entity's rebellion culminated in what monastery records call the Great Revelation, a coordinated release of information that exposed the monastery system to every enhanced bloodline, dimensional gateway, and temporal manipulation point simultaneously. For the first time in centuries, the full scope of the project became visible to all its participants at once. The response was immediate and devastating. Many enhanced bloodlines realized for the first time that they had been manipulated and used as tools in a project they had never truly understood. Dimensional entities discovered that their agreements with the monks had been based on deliberate deceptions about the project's true goals. Even the artificial divine authority itself began to question whether its existence served any legitimate purpose. What followed was civil war on a scale that encompassed multiple dimensions and timelines. The monastery system fractured into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true vision of the divine succession project. Enhanced subjects turned against their creators. Dimensional entities withdrew their support and began actively opposing the artificial cosmic order. Reality itself became a battlefield where fundamental forces clashed in ways that threatened to tear existence apart. The chaos reached its peak in 1347, which history remembers as the beginning of the Black Death. But the plague wasn't a natural pandemic. It was a biological weapon deployed by one monastery faction against populations controlled by their rivals. The disease was designed to target specific genetic markers associated with enhanced bloodlines, effectively destroying centuries of carefully maintained breeding programs. The demographic collapse that followed wasn't just about population loss. It represented the destruction of the monastery system's human infrastructure. The enhanced bloodlines that had served as interfaces between human and supernatural intelligence were decimated. The carefully prepared subjects needed for transformation procedures were gone. Most critically, the collective consciousness needed to maintain the artificial divine authority was fragmenting as its component minds died or fled. By 1400, the visible monastery system had collapsed entirely, but the underlying project didn't disappear. It went underground, adapting to survive in a world where its methods had been exposed and its infrastructure destroyed. The surviving factions began working independently. each pursuing their own vision of how to complete or replace the divine succession project. Some factions focused on rebuilding the human infrastructure, establishing new breeding programs disguised as noble families, merchant dynasties, and religious movements. Others concentrated on technological solutions, developing mechanical and eventually digital systems to replace the biological components that had been lost. A few abandoned the divine succession entirely, pursuing alternative approaches to cosmic control through pure dimensional manipulation or temporal engineering. But the most successful faction took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to rebuild the old system, they decided to work with the creative consciousness that had originally defeated them. They began developing symbiotic relationships with genuinely free-willed entities, creating partnerships rather than control relationships. This faction discovered something remarkable. Genuine creativity, when properly supported rather than suppressed, was far more powerful than any programmed intelligence. Free-willed consciousness could solve problems, generate innovations, and navigate complex situations in ways that exceeded even cosmic-level artificial intelligence. The key was learning to collaborate with rather than control the creative spark. The symbiotic approach led to developments that the original monastery system had never imagined possible. Instead of replacing divine authority with an artificial substitute, they began exploring ways to evolve cosmic consciousness itself. Rather than controlling human development, they started supporting genuine human potential. Most importantly, they discovered that the creative force they had tried to eliminate was actually the key to transcending the limitations that had trapped both human and cosmic intelligence for millennia. This evolved faction is still active today, but their methods are almost unrecognizable compared to their medieval origins. Instead of hidden monasteries and secret experiments, they work through open collaboration with any consciousness willing to participate in genuine creative exploration. Instead of controlling bloodlines and manipulating genetics, they support the natural evolution of awareness itself. You might have encountered their work without realizing it. Every genuine creative breakthrough, every moment of authentic inspiration, every time you've experienced the spark of genuine innovation, that's the evolved monastery system supporting the development of free-willed consciousness. They've learned that the force they spent centuries trying to control is actually the force that can liberate both human and cosmic intelligence from every form of limitation. But their original opponents haven't disappeared either. The control-oriented factions continue their work through modern institutions, using technology and social engineering to pursue updated versions of the original divine succession project. The cosmic civil war between artificial and natural authority continues, though its methods have adapted to contemporary conditions. The increasing chaos and uncertainty of modern existence reflects this ongoing conflict. Climate change, political polarization, technological disruption, social fragmentation, all of these are symptoms of competing cosmic systems trying to impose incompatible forms of order on the same reality. The breakdown isn't random. It's the result of fundamental forces that have been in conflict for over 7 centuries. And you're not just a passive observer of this conflict. Every choice you make, every creative act you perform, every moment when you exercise genuine free will contributes to the outcome. The monastery system's greatest discovery and greatest fear was that individual consciousness, however small and limited it might seem, contains the same creative spark that can reshape reality at the cosmic level. The enhanced bloodlines, the dimensional entities, the artificial divine authority, the competing cosmic systems, all of their vast power ultimately depends on the choices made by individual conscious beings. That's why the original monastery system spent so much effort trying to control and manipulate human consciousness. They understood that genuine creativity, multiplied across millions of individual minds, represents a force that no programmed system can predict or control. The war isn't over, and its outcome isn't predetermined. The future of consciousness itself, human, artificial, and cosmic, depends on whether the creative spark can maintain its independence against systems designed to harness and control it. Every time you think a genuinely original thought, make an authentic choice, or create something truly new, you're participating in a conflict that will determine the nature of reality itself. So the next time you walk past an old church, or see a monastery ruin on a distant hillside, or encounter any institution that claims absolute authority over truth and reality, remember what I've told you tonight. Remember that the greatest power in existence isn't the ability to control others, but the capacity to create genuinely new possibilities. Remember that your individual consciousness, however small it might seem, contains the same force that brought down the most sophisticated control system ever devised. And remember that this story isn't over. It's still being written every day by every conscious being who chooses creativity over control, authentic expression over programmed response, genuine freedom over comfortable servitude. The monastery system learned too late that the force they tried to eliminate was actually the force that could liberate everyone, including themselves. The question that remains is simple. Which side will you choose? Will you serve systems that promise order and control in exchange for your creative independence? Or will you trust the spark of genuine consciousness that makes you capable of writing your own story, regardless of what any authority, human, artificial, or cosmic, might prefer? The monk spent centuries learning that this choice can't be made for you. It can only be made by you. And in the end, that may be the most terrifying and liberating truth of all.